Welcome to the Music Tech Teacher Podcast. Music tech tips, lesson ideas, advice, news, and interviews, especially for music teachers. Brought to you by midnightmusic.com.au. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Music Tech Teacher Podcast. I'm Katie Wardrobe from midnightmusic.com.au, where I help music teachers use technology effectively in music education. Now, I'm sitting here today, it's late November and kind of a little bit unusually for Melbourne where I live. We've had some really hot weather for the past couple of weeks. We haven't even quite hit summer yet. That actually starts tomorrow on December the 1st. So I'm sitting here in very warm weather with my air conditioning running, and I'm hoping it's not going to affect the sound quality of the podcast too much. I would turn it off, but it's not very comfortable without it on at the moment. Now, almost every day I see a different music teacher post on Facebook asking for ideas for using GarageBand or Soundtrap with their students. Now, many teachers find themselves either with Macs that have GarageBand already installed, or their school or district has perhaps decided to go down the path of using Chromebooks, and they might have Soundtrap, which is an online software application which does roughly the same type of thing as GarageBand. Now, Soundtrap actually has the benefit of working across all platforms, Mac, PC, iPad, Chromebook, and so on. So it is actually an excellent choice if you've got a mixture of devices at your school. So most teachers are really keen to use GarageBand or Soundtrap in a meaningful way, and they really want lesson ideas that will teach the musical concepts and tie in with what they're already doing. And I see a lot of people also expressing their desire to move students away from using pre-made loops that you can find in those programs and get them onto creating original material. So in today's episode, I wanted to cover a few things. I thought I would talk about how to get started using GarageBand or Soundtrap with your students. I'm going to talk generally, in general terms really, and it's going to be really including both software programs here because their functions are really quite similar. If you don't have GarageBand or Soundtrap, you might have something else which is, again, similar, something like Mixcraft or any of those DAWs, digital audio workstations that do the same type of thing that allow you to record your voice or real instruments, or even use software instruments to record different parts. So I wanted to cover how to get started and also how to decide what your outcomes should be for the lesson that you're doing and how to focus those outcomes without getting waylaid. That's another important part. Now, the second part of this, I want to talk about the golden rule for all music tech projects that I think is really important. And if you follow the golden rule, it will often kind of prevent a lot of issues happening that would otherwise occur. So we'll talk about that. And then lastly, I wanted to talk about some specific ideas for lessons or projects at kind of like 4 different experience levels. So from, beginner, starting out type projects through to more advanced ones. Originally, I had intended this episode to be fairly short and succinct, but like most of the episodes where I'm recording by myself or even with another person, I end up talking for a lot longer than I thought I was going to. So what I've done with this episode is actually divided into part 1 and part 2. You'll hear today part 1 of the ideas for using GarageBand and Soundtrap, and in the follow-up episode, which will come out next week, you'll hear part 2. Now, if you're listening to this while you're out and about, don't worry. I will have an outline of the things that we've talked about. I'm actually going to include an outline of the content of today's episode, not just the links to websites and things that I might mention, but I'll include the tips and the lesson ideas as well. And they'll go onto the show notes page for this episode, which is at midnightmusic.com.au/42. There will also be a few links to a couple of free example lessons that I've got on my website that you can do with your students and some follow-up reading too. So first of all, getting started. Now, it's really important to think about your educational outcomes first. I think a lot of us get caught up in, I've got this new software program, I'm pretty sure I could use it in a meaningful way, but I don't know how to use it. So I'm just going to go and learn how to use the software program first. And then often that becomes the lesson for the students, how to get started in GarageBand, how to start a new project and so on. I really think it's important to kind of reverse that a little bit and think more about the educational outcomes that you want to achieve in the lesson first. Learning the software will kind of come alongside that, I find. So if you choose some kind of project with musical outcomes, then the learning of the software program will sort of happen naturally as you go. And that's both for you and for the students too. So it's really important to define those outcomes early on, and I kind of put these into two areas here. There might be musical outcomes for the project, so musical and educational type outcomes. But then again, there might also be some technical outcomes that you want to achieve. Now, the reason for having the tech skills in there is that having a good grounding in some basic music tech skills, especially in the first early projects that you do, can mean that you can then get students on to more advanced things down the track. And they're going to need those tech skills when they do the more advanced projects. So in the early times, you might be focused more on the kids learning the tech skills than you are on the music side of things. But I think you can incorporate both all along. So good to focus on just one or two things, especially when you're getting started. So from a musical point of view, you might just concentrate purely on form or on melody or on creating a rhythm or on a chord progression or the difference between major and minor chords, for instance. Now, those are all examples that could be individual standalone little projects surrounding those things. Then the tech skills that I mentioned as well, that might be another part of the project that you're doing. The advanced projects that you'll do down the track will encompass more things. So you might incorporate all of those things, form and melody and rhythm and chord progressions and so on. Also going to say that I think it's okay to have some pre-made components as part of the projects that students are working on, especially in those early days. The aim eventually is to increase the original material, I think, that they're creating, but it's okay to use some of those pre-made loops and so on. And I think you can use them to your advantage and basically take advantage of them around what the focus is for you for the lesson. And over time, students are going to pick up a wider range of music producing techniques, and that's going to really help them down the track. So when talking about starting simple, I'm thinking easy, quick projects. And in fact, when I've worked with students in the past and when I run workshops with teachers, this is exactly what I do. I pick the first thing that we're going to do is going to be a quick and easy project. Having said that, everything should have a purpose, I think. So I don't personally do one of those open up the app and play around and do what you want for an entire lesson. I don't think it's the end of the world if you do that, but I tend to find that giving even the very first session on a software program some kind of focus or meaning is a great way to get started. So focusing on just one or two musical aspects is great. And there are lots of beginner tech skills to learn when you first start using software, and that's either for you yourself or for the students. And you know what it's like I do, when you've got a whole group of people, there can be varying tech skill levels, just general levels, and there can be varying experience with the software that you're using. So starting off with something simple means that everyone's going to do the same kind of thing at the same time, and I think that that's a really good thing. In a very beginner project, even when it's a very simple one, students are still going to learn all of a big range of tech skills, including how to start a new project, how to add or select an instrument. They're going to learn how to play that instrument, and I'm talking software instruments here, so knowing how to open up the on-screen keyboard and changing octaves and changing the sound. They're going to learn how to control playback of their project, so starting and stopping and recording. They're going to need to know how to turn on and off the metronome and count in, how to fix mistakes or re-record things, how to add new tracks, how to adjust levels, how to save and how to export. And all of those things you can actually cover in a beginner lesson. And so this is what I like to do. Choose something really simple, because for me, the focus is going to largely be on learning all of those basic tech skills. And we'll also have a couple of musical outcomes in there as well. The thing that I've found over time that has become very apparent is that if it's the very first time you're using GarageBand or Soundtrap with your students, everything is probably going to take longer than you think it will. So I can often devise some kind of project which I think is a really quick one, and in my head it might only take 20 minutes, and for me personally it would probably only take 10 or 15 minutes to do. But when you do it with a group, that's going to be a full lesson, like 40 minutes worth of material. So just be warned that that's probably what's going to happen, and that's okay. Embrace that and know that this is going to be the basis of lots of other projects that you're going to do in the future. Now, before I get on to talking about very specific lesson ideas at different levels, I want to talk about that golden rule that I mentioned in the introduction. Now, the golden rule here of everything you're going to do with music tech is to do the entire project yourself from start to finish before you do it with your students. I cannot emphasize enough how important this is. It's still something that I do every single time I'm doing a new project with a group of people, and I still even do it with all of the projects that I've done over and over and over for years and years. If I haven't done something for a little while, or I haven't opened the app or the software for a little while, I will still do it ahead of a workshop or with a group of students, just because it helps me to realize what are the things that might go wrong for people. What are the things that went wrong for me? If it goes wrong for me, I can be pretty sure that some of the people in the group are going to have the same problem. Is there anything that's a surprise? So this is a really good thing. Sometimes I think in my head, yep, we can do this, this and this. And when I go and do it in practice, I find, oh, actually, no, the software doesn't work like that, or it doesn't have the feature I thought it did. So going through and working out what are those things that you were surprised by, that's a great thing to do. And just it heads off all those issues at the pass. I've also realized over time, and it's happened with students and with adults, that there are little things that are surprising to other people, which may not be surprising to me. So one prime example that I can think of is that often when people are using these type of programs for the first time, they might lay down their first track, and this might be a guitar part, let's say, and then they go back to the beginning and they press record to record the second track. Now, at this point in time, you're going to play the second track material along with what's going on in the first track, and it's often a surprise to people that the first track plays back into their headphones while they're recording the second track. Now, to me, that's not something I thought was surprising or unusual when I first started doing this sort of stuff, but honestly, a lot of people are shocked by this and put off by it. So, when I demonstrate things to a group of people, I will often say, and when we record the second track, we're going to hear the first track playing along at the same time. And I also mention to them that if they want to turn that down, the volume down of the first track, or even mute it because it's less off-putting, they can do that, and I'll show them where. Now, I know to say that ahead of time because I've had this thing come up in so many instances. So those sorts of things, when you do the whole project yourself, those are the sorts of things you might pick up. Now, when you do it yourself from start to finish as well, you might find that some things are quicker to do than you thought they were going to be, and more likely is that it's slower to do than you thought it might be. So as I said, I think about a project in my head and I'm like, yep, we can do this in 5 minutes. And then no, when I do it myself, it might take 10. And if it takes me 10, it's going to take a group of people probably double that time. So just be aware of how long it takes you to do different things. And one of the most important parts of doing it yourself is to run through all the way to completion. And by that I mean going through the saving and exporting part of the project to the end. So what is it that you want the students to do when they've completely finished their project? Do you want them to save it into a particular location? Do you want them to export it as a certain type of file? If it's a GarageBand project, maybe you want them to export it as a WAV file or an MP3 file, some kind of audio format, and then they're going to save it somewhere. Or do you want them to airdrop it to you? Or if you're on Soundtrap, are they just going to send it to you as the teacher? You can kind of do that internally because it's an online tool. So all of those things are really good to work out ahead of time. It's going to save you time and headaches when you're running it with the class. My last tip with this is when you do the project yourself, write down the procedure and save it somewhere. So you may think that, because you've run 2 classes in 1 week, that you are never going to forget ever again how to do this thing. But I can guarantee that when you don't do it for another few weeks and you come back to it with a different group of students, you're going to think to yourself, oh, I can't remember what I did last time with this, or where did I save it, or how did we export, or what was the smoothest workflow. I can highly recommend writing down, even just dot points, what you've done and how you've done it and where you've done it and all of those things. Save it somewhere really good. I do this. I save everything into my Google Drive account. I used to use Evernote a lot. You can still use Evernote. But most things I save into Google Drive, and I've got it handy anytime, anywhere. Super, super useful. This episode of the Music Tech Teacher podcast is brought to you by the Midnight Music Community. The Midnight Music Community is an online space for music teachers who'd like help using technology in their music lessons. There are online courses, video tutorials, lesson plans, music tech news, and professional development certificates are provided for any training that you undertake. I'm inside the community every day, personally answering members' questions and sharing tips and ideas. The best thing is that you get to connect with hundreds of other music teachers just like you and share your own experiences and occasional music tech frustrations. For more information and a special joining price just for the listeners of this podcast, visit midnightmusic.com.au/podcast offer. That's midnightmusic.com.au/podcast offer. Now, before we jump into the actual lesson ideas, I promise I am getting to them. I think I've said before we jump into them a couple of times now. I just want to talk a couple of tips for the running of the lesson. Now, you can run a music tech lesson in multiple ways. My general way of doing things is that I have my computer plugged in to a data projector and to speakers, and I tend to most of the time show a bit of the project and then everyone has a go at that part, and then I might show the next bit and then everyone has a go at that part. I don't show too much at once because people will not remember it, so just little snippets and then get everyone to go and do their own one. Sometimes, however, I do find that it's easier to do a play along with me type lesson. So sometimes you go along and do the same thing at the same time. I find that I only do that for bits and pieces, little sections of the lesson, particularly something like the last part where you're telling people where to save or how to export and so on. It's kind of easier just to get everyone to do that at the same time simultaneously if you're all ready to do it at that time. As I mentioned earlier, everything takes a bit longer than you think it will, and it's really good to leave enough time for students to do their bit. So if you have shown something and then you get the class to do their bit, and they're working away on their computers, they need a little bit of time to just get their head around things. And if you've been looking at the software a lot, you're probably very familiar with where to click and where to drag things or where to move stuff. People who are really new to the software are kind of like immersed in this new experience, and it can be hard to find things quickly. So that's how I've treated it. And the other big tip that I can recommend is that when I'm working, I tend to show a little bit and then, get students to do stuff. And then at the end, it's really good to be able to show everyone your finished version of the project. I tend to hold that off till, kind of near the end because I don't want to influence people's creative choices by what I've done. But it is really good to have one that you've prepared earlier, particularly if you're kind of showing them a best case example. That's not quite the word, but you know what I mean. Showing them some sort of example is a really great thing. I have completed versions of every project that I am doing in a workshop, even if I can create it alongside everyone in the lesson time or in the workshop time. It's really good to have that finished version because you'll often find you need to go and float around the room and help people with different bits and pieces. So you can come back to the front of the room towards the end and say, look, here's the version that I've prepared earlier. And it's a really great thing just to be able to show that. Okay, let's get on to some lesson ideas. I'm finally up to this point. Now, I'm referring here to GarageBand and Soundtrap, as I mentioned. And for GarageBand here, I'm kind of referring at the moment to the desktop version. But realistically, most of the things that I'm going to talk about will work on the iPad version as well. Soundtrap as well. If you don't have Soundtrap and you've got PCs or Chromebooks, other options include things like Mixcraft or Soundation. And all of these ideas will work on all of these software programs. I've really chosen GarageBand and Soundtrap because they are the ones that I see mentioned the most when I see this question pop up on Facebook and so on. Okay, so level 1 kind of projects, easy things. Let's talk about those to start with. Now, I like to do just a project with 1 or 2 tracks, maybe up to 3 tracks in total, and keep it really short. So the first projects that I do with a group of people are only around 8 bars long or so. You can go longer, of course, and sometimes you might be talking about form, in which case you may end up copying and pasting chunks of music which give you a longer piece, but starting short is a really good thing to do. Now, a simple idea that I've done a lot and has been really popular, with people who have been reading my blog, my website, is a simple rap-based activity. So creating some kind of drum pattern to start with is a really, really good project to do for students, and you can do it in so many different ways in both Soundtrap and GarageBand, and even this can have different levels in it. You can kind of do the ready-made version of creating a drum pattern, which might be using a loop or something sort of pre-made, or you can get students to record their own from scratch. Now, at the time of recording, Soundtrap's just recently added in to their program a drum sequencer, which is fantastic. And there's also one in the iPad version of GarageBand where you can kind of tap on a square in the kick drum part, and that will put a sound on the first beat in the first bar, and you can build up a pattern using snare drum and hi-hats and so on. Really easy to do and lots of fun, and it's quite quick once students know some basic principles about how to do that. So if your prime focus for this lesson is perhaps to teach students how to do a drum pattern, then I would go for the more manual version of this, so them creating it from scratch. If, however, your focus is going to be more on the rapping part of the project, i.e. getting students to write their own rhyme first of all, rap, and then say it in time to a beat, perhaps that's your main focus, then in that instance, you might want them to go ahead and use some ready-made drum patterns because it's going to get you quicker through that part of the project. So there's lots and lots of options here for how you do it. So one that I've done in the past is called Rap My Name. I'm sure I've mentioned it on other episodes of the podcast. It's available for download from my website, and I'll put a link in the show notes. And basically this one gets the students to create a simple drum pattern for 8 bars. There's a template rap that they can fill in the gaps for, and it's all about themselves. So they're going to say something about themselves and something they like. And there's a pattern here which is worked out ahead of time. And the reason for that is you may not want to spend your class time on the creative writing part of it, but you might want them to get more quickly onto the recording the rap part of it. So that's a really basic, great first project. It just teaches a few things. So if you're doing this where you've only got the drum pattern and the rap, you will also get the students to learn all those other things that we talked about earlier in terms of tech skills. So to do this, they're going to start a new project. They're going to add a drum track. They're going to record the drum part. They're going to add another track, which will be their voice. So that'll be like a microphone or an audio recording part. Then they're going to work out how to record their voice and do that well. Then they're going to perhaps fix mistakes up if they've made mistakes. They're going to know how to play back their song. They're going to add other parts if they want to. They may even add some very simple automation, so a fade out at the end of the whole piece. They might add that as well. And all of these things are basic tech skills, but there's an awful lot of them that go into this one simple project. So really good way to start. Other simple projects you can start off with are simply getting students to record something like a melody of 4 bars long, and then get them to record a contrasting melody of 4 bars straight after that. And then they might go back and copy the first melody and put it at the end of the second melody, and then you've got a piece which is in A-B-A form. So the focus of the lesson in this instance might be form, A-B-A form, and also recording a melody. And it could just be the melody. That's all you need to do, maybe just the melody alone. If you've got quick students, they could actually add something else to go with their melody, but the focus of the lesson might just be the melody in this instance. Another simple project is to get students to record themselves singing or playing just one section of a piece that they're working on. So if they're in band, orchestra, chorus, some other ensemble, or they're doing private music lessons, they might take out a piece and just record a short snippet of something they're working on. This also has the benefit of teaching them all of those basic tech skills, and it's just a simple project. They can put the metronome on, put some headphones in so they can hear the metronome and press record, and it's great practice them playing in time to the metronome and getting the part recorded that way. They might also add some sort of percussive backing to go with what they've recorded or some other part. One other thing I'll mention in this easy category is taking some kind of rhythmic thing that you're doing with students already, and I'm thinking something like a clapping game, and getting them to replicate the pattern in GarageBand or Soundtrap. So you can take a clapping pattern. I've done this with great success and hilarity in workshops where I've taught a group of teachers the boom, snap, clap clapping game, which has 3 distinctive sounds, the boom, the snap and the clap. And it translates really well into kind of comparing it to the parts of the kit. So the boom becomes a kick drum, the snap becomes the hi-hat, and the clap becomes the snare drum, the middle kind of sound. And it's really great to take that pattern that we've been clapping and then go ahead and put it into some kind of software program so they can record the boom part in the bass drum, the clap part is the I'm getting confused now. The clap part is the snare drum and the hi-hat part matches the snap. So they can record all of these in GarageBand and Soundtrap. And once they record them, they can play them back to check that they're correct, check that it sounds rhythmically correct and matches up with what they've learnt in the clapping game, and so on. Really great exercise to do. It's a good kind of early transcribing exercise, makes people listen a lot, and again, it teaches all of those basic tech skills. One great tip that I'm going to just put in here is that it can be really useful to provide students with a template, especially when you're starting out. So if you really want to make the focus a musical aspect of the lesson and you don't have a lot of time for the students to perhaps set up a new project from scratch and start instrument tracks and choose sounds and so on, it can be really, really useful to provide them with a template where a lot of this stuff is set up ahead of time. You can even provide a template with some of the recorded material in there, and then students are perhaps just filling in a gap. So one example might be perhaps you've been doing pentatonic melodies with your students and they've been composing their own. You might provide them with a template which has perhaps 2 bars or 4 bars already recorded, and then the same 4 bars at the end, and then in the middle there's a gap. There's an empty 4 bars where the students need to create their own melody using the notes of the pentatonic scale. Now, having it set up like this is brilliant. I've done this in workshops that I've run in the past, in many types of workshops too, not just GarageBand and Soundtrap, but for instance in Sibelius workshops where, to set up a notation file from scratch, it's quick when you know how to do it, but when you're getting a group of 20 people to do it simultaneously, it can literally take 10 to 15 minutes to get through that part, and we haven't even gotten to putting any notes into the file. So with GarageBand and Soundtrap, same sort of thing. Sometimes you can spend an awful lot of time explaining what the key is that we need and the tempo and the, which instrument are we choosing, and someone went to the wrong place, so then you've got to go back and work out where they went wrong, and all of these things take a long time. So if you've got short lesson time and you want to really focus on something specific, using a template which you can give to students at the beginning of the class can really save a lot of setup time if you want them to achieve something really fast. Let's talk about level 2, kind of moving on projects. And even though I've divided these all up into like levels, I've got level 1, 2, 3 and 4 here. A lot of these can be done can be adapted in many ways. So some of the later things that I'm going to talk about as examples of advanced projects, I've actually done them with very young beginner students. It's just that you can adjust your expectations and the types of thing that they'll do in the project. But anyway, I'm going to talk about some level 2 type projects after you've done some basic things. Now, one that I really like is to use the 12-bar blues. A lot of people do the blues with students in middle school somewhere. It's a great one to do in GarageBand and Soundtrap. So what you can get students to do, it might be really as simple as getting them to record the chord sequence for the 12-bar blues using a guitar or keyboard instrument. Now, that could be the entire project, just getting students to record that and to get the chord changes in correctly. That might be enough for you. That might be one whole lesson. Now, if you want to do a little bit more, you might get students to add a walking bass line to go along with that chord sequence and perhaps a drum part. Then if you've got a bit more time, and particularly if you've got some students that work quite quickly or who are more advanced, you might get them to add another track, which is like a melody or a solo track, and get them to improvise something using the blues scale. Now, even beginner students can do this. They can just be shown 3 notes of the blues scale, or 2 notes even, and they can just stick to those couple of notes and create some sort of improvised melody over the top of the backing that they've created. More advanced students, of course, can use the full blues scale and go for their life. Now, another one that I've done, which has also been a lot of fun, is to do the blues, but actually to do the blues in a really different style. I call it the dubstep blues or tango blues, depending on which group of people I'm working with. But basically, if you use the blues chord sequence, but change particularly the drum pattern, it's going to change the flavour of the whole thing. And you can really get some interesting types of arrangements, and it's a great way to actually introduce arranging and talk about what it is in the arrangement that really affects the way the piece feels. So even by simply changing the drum pattern, you can get a really different sounding blues sequence, and that can be lots and lots of fun. I've done that a lot in both the desktop version of GarageBand and the iPad version as well, where we've used the smart instruments to do that. And it's just been a great success. It's a really different way of looking at the blues, and it comes quite well at the end of, a unit of work where you've been performing the blues, you've talked about the chord pattern, you've played it on guitars or on keyboard, perhaps you've, discussed the chord sequence itself, perhaps you've discussed improvisation, you've looked at the history of the blues, and this might be something that you do and at the end, for a bit of fun, but also it's a creative project. Now, other next level type projects in this area may actually be more storytelling type activities. This is also something I found has gone down really, really well, is to do some kind of storytelling activity. I've done a few different things here. One is that you can get students to choose some kind of children's story or a poem. I'm actually going to do, the next time I do this, I'm going to use Dr. Seuss, part of a Dr. Seuss book, just, maybe a page or 2 out of Hop on Pop or something. They're very long. You wouldn't want to use the whole thing, but just using a short section where it's kind of fun and maybe a bit rhythmical. Some of those storybooks as well for children that have great play on words, a lot of sound words in them. There is a series, and the name escapes me at the moment, but I know some of you will know what I'm talking about. Taking some of those books or even interesting poems and getting students to record those in GarageBand or Soundtrap can be a fantastic activity. So they can start off by just recording the story or section of the story themselves, and then after that they can add tracks and record sound effects or even mood music if they're up to it to go with the story that they've created. This is a fantastic group project where you might have one student is assigned as the narrator, one student might be assigned the person who's making the sound effects, creating the sound itself. Another person in the group might be assigned the music producer kind of role where they're the one operating the microphone that the students are using. So great type of project to do. And I really like this project or ones like it because it can lead really well down the track into things like film scoring and radio shows, which I'll talk about a little bit later. So a great one to do. Now, I know a number of schools actually do this idea where they record a children's story, and they get the students who are perhaps in, year 5 or year 6 to do this, and then they record those stories for the younger students at the school. So this is a really nice way to create some kind of connection between the older and the younger students. Now, in similar way, I've done another project which I've called Nursery Rhymes Recut, where I took a nursery rhyme. The one I did was Goldilocks and the Three Bears, and I rewrote it as a news report. So in my news report, actually, the bears were the innocent people, and they had someone break into their property and eaten the porridge, and the person was last seen, and she had, golden hair, and she was seen fleeing the property into the nearby woods. And so I wrote this story around the concept of the Goldilocks and the Three Bears story, and made it a news report. So this was lots of fun to do. And then I started thinking about all the other nursery rhymes and how I could turn them around and make them into news reports too. But what I did was basically record my voice saying the news report, and it's really quite short. It's about probably 1 minute long or so, and then added introduction music and outro music and some sound effects or stingers, those little quick chords that happen in a news report or in a radio show, just to kind of emphasize something. Lots and lots of fun. The other thing that you can do with both these nursery rhyme idea and the story or poem idea is that when students record their narration, one fantastic thing to do in terms of learning a new tech skill is that they can select part of their speaking track, and actually change the sound of their voice. So this is really quite easy to do. You can select a portion and then add some effect to your voice. So a speaking voice, which is a child's voice or a female voice, you can add an effect to make it really low. So when I did the nursery rhymes example, I had, the father bear said, "Who's been eating my porridge?" And I just selected that part of my recording and I dropped it down an octave or two, and then suddenly it sounded very low, like a man's voice, and very gruff kind of sounding. I did the same thing with the baby bear voice. I pitched my voice higher and it kind of sounded like a chipmunk effect. So that can be lots of fun. You can do some really great effects in these programs, and it's just a simple and easy way to get into the tech skills. In a similar way, same type of skills, you could choose to do a podcast. And a podcast, like the one you're listening to, can be about anything really. I love the idea of getting students to record a podcast about some kind of historical topic that you might be covering in class. If we go back to the blues as an example, you might be studying the blues, and part of their unit of work might be that they create an audio report about the blues where they're talking about what it is, and perhaps talking about examples of artists and famous pieces of music and where the blues are today and all of those things. And they can record that as a podcast. It's like a radio show essentially. And it can just be a quite an engaging way. Rather than doing a written report about the blues, they are doing this audio recording. So you end up with a multimedia type result. Now, in the next episode, I'll be following up with part 2 of this series, and I'll be talking about some more ideas for using GarageBand and Soundtrap with your music students. The Music Tech Teacher podcast is hosted by me, Katie Wardrobe. You can find more information and links from today's episode at midnightmusic.com.au/42. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.